band, Stone Temple Pilots strike me as a group that would have been successful in any era. Unlike the other big names of the alternative scene who were more closely associated with the modern look and sound, they were cribbing from all of rock and roll history. From 60s bubblegum psychedelia and garage rock, to 70s hard rock and glam, right up to the more fashionable post-punk, indie rock, and grunge styles. Those who stuck with them long enough could even detect some Latin and soul and lounge-infused stuff on their albums. They had a range and versatility as a band while still retaining an identifiable core and personality that helped to solidify what the rock genre would sound like for basically the entirety of the decade. In fact, at the time of this recording in 2018, I can honestly say that of the top 5 or 6 most popular and iconic rock bands of the 90s, STP are the ones whose songs I think hold up the best, removed from the context of their time period. But that context is exactly what has kept them such a critically undervalued band for all this time. I'm not going to mince words. Despite their success, they were never one of the most respected bands around. When they first arrived in the scene, they immediately got branded as derivative bandwagon jumpers, unoriginal posers, corporate rockers, grunge copycats, and trend-chasing coattail riders. And unfair as it may have been, they never quite escaped that reputation in the public consciousness. Why? Well, as far as I can tell, it was because their singer sort of sounded like Eddie Vedder in a couple of songs. And since no singer had ever reminded anyone of another singer before ever, this was an actual big deal. By the time the decade was over, in the wake of a billion other actual terrible grunge impersonators, it was clear that they were their own thing entirely. But they still caught way more flack than they deserved simply for starting off on the wrong foot, and by having the audacity to be one of the first bands to find success in the early days of the post-alternative rock boom. None of this was helped by the fact that their lead singer, Scott Weiland, aside from sounding like Vedder a little bit sometimes, seemed permanently fixed on a path of constant self-destruction. On the one hand, yes, it is sad as hell that Scott Weiland never fully resolved his issues with hard drugs and passed away in 2015 of an overdose. On the other hand, if you had told people back in the 90s that the lead singer of Stone Temple Pilots was going to live to be 48, they would probably have said, well, looks like he lives a pretty long time. I think a lot of fans just got so used to the idea that he was one of these wild, uncontrollable, one-foot-in-the-grave drug casualties that to think he would actually make it that far in life would have seemed like misplaced optimism at best. We saw so many tabloid headlines, possession charges, stints in rehab, abrupt band hiatuses, tour cancellations, and other personal drama that it must have been frustrating trying to remain a longtime fan of this band. If it can all visibly come crashing down at any time, it's hard to let yourself feel too attached. And it never occurred to me to think of it this way before, but being a fan of a musician with a serious drug problem is almost comparable to having someone in your life who suffers from an addiction. You want the best for them, but you get let down so many times that it starts to get really hard to stay invested. And suddenly the thought of checking out entirely looks more and more attractive. So even while on paper, STP continued having hit songs, the actual story of their 90s career is an erratic hot mess, filled with fits and starts and intermittent redemptions, until finally the cycle of rise and fall slowly and methodically petered itself out. Make no mistake, the initial breakthrough of alternative rock was a fluke. In order for the genre to go fully mainstream, it needed bands who could couch its rougher, more challenging elements within comfortable, traditional pop sensibilities. That's what alternative rock was about in the first place, right? Sprucing up the sounds of underground music with a higher degree of melodic sophistication and songwriting acumen? I mean, some will say that amounts to watering it down and selling it out, but those concerns never mattered much to me. Mainstream and independent is a false dichotomy. Art and comics are not mutually exclusive. Blah, blah, blah. Every generation seems like it wants a scene and a style to call its own, but it needs to arise organically, from the remnants of already existing elements that demonstrate an awareness and partial reverence for the past, while very much attempting to be its own thing and to do something different with the rather hidebound formalities of playing a particular genre of music. So I'm not going to claim there wasn't a certain degree of calculation to Stone Temple Pilots' success. What I will say is that over time, they proved to be the ones most qualified to make this calculation. In other words, this is the best case scenario for mainstreaming a genre that was really never all that non-commercial in the first place. The origins of Stone Temple Pilots date back to the late 80s, when brothers Robert and Dean DeLeo, on bass and guitar respectively, formed a band called Mighty Joe Young with Weiland and drummer Eric Kretz in San Diego, California. There is a story, possibly apocryphal, about how Scott and Robert originally met at a Black Flag show in 1985, and somehow in the course of getting to know each other, they found out they were both in what they thought was an exclusive relationship with the same woman. Apparently they bonded over this rather than throwing down in a fit of jealous rage, and eventually started playing music together. Side note, it's pretty funny that Weiland gets so much grief for sounding like Eddie Vedder, considering that Eddie himself was also from San Diego and would have been around at the same time they were getting started. Do you think they ever crossed paths? Whatever happened, the band eventually signed to Atlantic Records, and in the process of recording their debut with producer Brendan O'Brien, found out that there was already a blues musician going by the name of Mighty Joe Young. They liked the initials STP because of motor oil, I guess, and came up with a bunch of variations on band names using those initials, some of them quite crude, before finally settling on Stone Temple Pilots. And in 1992, they released their debut album, Core. Here's a fun game. I'm going to just play you a few hooks. Not to see if you recognize them, because I'm sure you will, or to highlight how impressive it is that they all come from the same band on their very first album, although it is pretty damn impressive. I just want you to try to put yourself in the 1992 headspace, and imagine what it would be like to hear these for the first time from that vantage point. I swear to you, when I play these back to back, I can practically hear the sound of the entire decade finally arriving, fully formed. Check it out. Criticism with Core is that STP's sound per se isn't all that interesting on it. Basically, it's just heavy, slow rock music without a whole lot of unique identifying features. Aside from the singles, the more up-tempo material tends to stand out the most. Interestingly, there are also a couple of short instrumental tracks where they almost sound like they're already trying to expand their sound, and points toward the more diverse band they would eventually become. Other than that, the sound of the album isn't trying to be a whole lot other than sludgy and raw, but on singles like Plush, it's an approach that sort of undermines the pop appeal of the songwriting. The guitar tones are bright and shiny and ringing and high-pitched, almost as if they're taking inspiration from Led Zeppelin's Houses of the Holy. But Scott's vocals, which admittedly are at their most Pearl Jam-y here, have a little too much angst and forcefulness in them. I actually think the vocal performance from the acoustic version of Plush is a lot better.
Well, she smell alone.
Speaking of an acoustic, how great is Creep? To me, this is the early SCP track that feels the most accomplished from a song structure standpoint. Musically, yeah, it kind of resembles a Metallica / Alice in Chains acoustic number with some Nirvana-ish inflections in the vocals, but the way the song unfolds feels natural and impeccable, establishing a dynamic series of melodic phrases, even layering them on top of each other, while continually raising the pitch and emotional tenor.
Take time with a wounded hand, 'cause it likes to heal, I like to steal.
By the way, if you're of the mindset that SCP were a rip-off band, this is the album by them that will make your case the best. But this guitar part is basically the same as a riff from an old R.I.P song.
Half the man I used to be.
Isn't Sex Type Thing just the riff from Tom Petty's Running Down a Dream? Anyway, back on Creep. There basically isn't any single point in this song that doesn't contain a big, memorable hook somewhere.
Think your company that tells me I'm free.
And as their career progressed, that would turn out to be their greatest strength, even while the follow-up album, 1994's Purple, basically stuck to the same slow and heavy formula. First of all, that is one awesome album cover. I like to think this album went straight to #1 the week of its release on the strength of its cover alone. The boring truth is that this would have been one of the most anticipated albums of that year anyway, thanks in part to the track Big Empty, which they contributed to the soundtrack of the film The Crow.
Too much walking, shoehorn thing. Time to take her home, her daisy head is contemplating.
Listening to just the verses of this song, you can suddenly see a new Stone Temple Pilots emerge. Nothing they did on the first album comes close to this level of subtlety and strange, uneasy beauty. The verses are built on this minor 7th and 7th chord pattern, almost an inversion of the chords from Creep, but giving it a moodier, more tentative vibe.
Smoke a cigarette and lie some more. These conversations
so that when the song abruptly explodes into major keys in the chorus, it feels that much more powerful. This is where SCP began to really come into their own. They were never going to be the heaviest band, or the most melodically gifted, or the most emotionally resonant, or even the most eclectic. What they were, I believe, was the cleverest. They had the ability to put a fresh spin on the common themes and even cliches of classic rock that no one else really had at the time. If the band can be said to have just one universally beloved classic in its repertoire, it's probably this. I don't have to dwell on this song too much. It's a damn good song. You and I and everyone else knows it. Even the people who dismiss them as a grunge copycat band could dig this. But we're all on the same page here, right? Well, guess what? Turns out this awesome riff was apparently stolen from an old Jim Croce song. But it doesn't matter. They showed that you didn't have to be the most original band in the world to be compelling. All you needed was a certain degree of swagger and charisma and adherence to the principles of sound structure in songwriting, and at least a few knockout pop hooks per song. A combination of attributes which I like to think of as cleverness. They knew damn well who they were and what they were doing at this point. It just took a little while for the rest of the world to catch up. It helped that the production, still by Brendan O'Brien, is a lot more clear and not as muddy as it was on Core. Even though the songs are still slow to mid-tempo and heavy, the band's priority is more focused on catchy songcraft than it is on mere rawness or intensity. The album where they found their strengths and began playing to them more consistently. Unfortunately, it's also the point in their career where things already started going off the rails. Weiland's major struggles with substance abuse started back during the band's tour in support of their first album, during which they actually turned down the gig opening for Aerosmith, a slot that Weiland's future bandmates in Guns N' Roses had previously filled, so they could tour with perennial indie darlings Butthole Surfers and Firehose. As he tells it, he had been using coke since his teens, and added heroin to the mix almost as if it were a rite of passage for being a rock musician. 1995 was when his troubles with the law started really interfering with the functioning of the band, including an arrest for possession of crack cocaine. This led to the band splitting as a creative entity for the first time, with Weiland forming the Magnificent Bastards, and the rest of the group joining singer Dave Coots in a band called Talk Show. Eventually they did reunite and release their third album, Tiny Music, Songs from the Vatican Gift Shop, in 1996, pivoting completely into a sound that had more in common with psychedelic and glam music than grunge, effectively achieving their final form as a band. As a frontman, Weiland had always adopted a persona that was some kind of cross between Jim Morrison, David Bowie, and Mick Jagger. And this is where you can really start to hear it in the music. It also helps that he no longer sings in Eddie Vedder's baritone range, not that it should have mattered. Whatever, people. Eddie Vedder doesn't own low vocals and weird phrasings. Instead, he has this higher-pitched, more raspy, and more post-punky style of singing that serves the songs a whole lot better and makes them sound like almost an entirely different band than they were before. She doesn't know. And there's an old band joke that goes, what is the last thing that a drummer says before getting kicked out of the band? Hey, why don't we try playing some of my songs? My favorite Stone Temple Pilots song is written by the drummer. Yep, with lyrics from Weiland, this is all composed and arranged by the drummer Eric Kretz. Not to take anything away from the brothers DeLeo, who wrote the music for most of the band's songs, but why was he not writing all the songs? I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that if SDP had sounded like this when they first came out, hipsters everywhere would have been singing their praises from day one. Of course, they probably wouldn't have been as successful that way. Is that what it was all about the whole time? Do first impressions really count for so much? Hey, check out this bass run where it sounds like Robert DeLeo's fingers are steadily climbing up the entire fretboard. While Purple is more consistently solid, I think that this is the album that best supports my case for STP as secretly the cleverest band of the 90s. There's a song here called Ride the Cliché. You can't tell me that they weren't highly aware of themselves and how they were perceived. Or look at a song like Art School Girl, which takes the soft verse, loud chorus trope of 90s rock and blows it up to an almost comical degree.
Rose, Alabama, Boulder City, New York City.
This is clearly parodic. Parodic? If this was a Pixies song, no one would question its brilliance. Finally, I just have to include a piece of this song, since I can't think of any other mainstream 90s band that could convincingly sound this much like one of Stereolab's bossa nova pastiches.
Unicorns on roller coasters, long grass making shades arrow.
Unfortunately, despite being their most musically accomplished album yet, Tiny Music was the beginning of yet another end. They had to cancel tour dates in 1996 and 1997 partially for Weiland's rehab, which probably contributed to this being their lowest selling album yet. In the meantime, the other band member's side project Talk Show recorded an album, and Weiland released his solo debut 12 Bar Blues in 1998. The future of the band remained in this uncertain limbo right up until they joined forces to record their 1999 album Number 4. Don't call it a comeback, because here comes another setback. As much as I hate to lead off with more bad news, around the time of this album's release, Weiland was serving 5 months of a 1-year jail sentence. And yet again, despite the turmoil, STP managed to put out another good album with even more diverse and fascinating songs, proving that especially by this point, there simply wasn't another band like them around. How often in the late 90s do you think we heard a song that sounds like a perfect cross between the Zombies, the Beach Boys, and the Doors, featuring one of the most gorgeous choruses you'll ever hear from the time period?
What would you do? What would you do if I followed you?
If you're into that side of them, there's more of that came from on the album, along with their trademark psych glam style that I can only describe as being an actually good version of what Oasis was merely attempting to do earlier in the decade. Show them how it's done.
I got you to paint the sorrow on my day, and I got you, and I got you to paint the roses on my grave. You can offer the hard time, he's got nowhere to hide. You can sleep with the sinker, but I'll for the ride. Keep it coming, I'm going all the way.
Give them credit, they kept trying. After the 90s ended, they released one more album called Shangri-La-Di-Da in 2001, by all accounts an even poppier and more lightweight affair than they'd ever done, and finally officially broke up in 2002. Weiland went on to front the supergroup Velvet Revolver with former members of Guns N' Roses, and they recorded 2 albums before Weiland ditched them to rejoin STP in 2008. The reformed band recorded a self-titled 2010 album before Weiland got the boot freaking-gen in 2011. In 2013, the members of STP began performing with Chester Bennington of Linkin Park on lead vocals, while Scott moved on to front the Wildabouts and Art of Anarchy. On December 3rd, 2015, Scott Weiland was found dead on the Wildabouts tour bus at the age of 48, 3 years ago this day. His death was later ruled an accidental overdose. After Chester Bennington's death by suicide in 2017, Stone Temple Pilots released another self-titled album earlier this year with singer Jeff Gutt, who I sincerely hope is being well taken care of. Given their track record with lead singers, let's just say I think they deserve a break. As unfortunate as it is that the band never really managed to find a long-term state of stability, their 90s discography speaks for itself. Probably because so many of their songs don't evoke its decade quite so strongly, they can be enjoyed more on their own merits, rather than being bound to a specific time period. The music had power, style, infectiousness, and no shortage of cleverness. And their place as one of the decade's most iconic mainstream groups is well earned. They were Stone Temple Pilots. And there weren't 21 of them. There were far fewer than 21. I am Jacob, and this was Rad 90s Music. Rest in peace, Scott Weiland.